All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Anjali Kalachalam, Senior Policy Analyst with Up for Growth. Welcome to the penultimate presentation of Up for Growth's ongoing webinar series. We are looking forward to a great discussion about fair share from coast to coast with experts from California, Massachusetts, and the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Up for Growth is proud to work with our sponsors, the Mortgage Bankers Association, the American Planning Association, and All New York Title Agency, who share our values and goals of bringing together policymakers, practitioners, and activists to work together for pro-housing solutions. Up for Growth firmly believes that housing should be an opportunity and never an obstacle. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Hugh Ryan, Vice President of Business Development and Strategy with All New York Title Agency, to talk about their work and support of Up for Growth.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Anjali said, my name is Hugh Ryan. I'm the Vice President of Business Development and Strategy for All New York Title Agency. This is an honor for us to be the episode sponsor. I had the opportunity to meet Mike a few weeks back, and I was very intrigued with the message that he delivered relative to the national housing crisis that we basically have throughout the United States. We reside here in the New York area. Our agency, All New York Title Agency, we've been in the affordable and supportive housing for over 25 years and have closed some of the most complex transactions in the New York area, from Essex Crossings in Manhattan, City Point in Brooklyn, Hunters Point in Queens. So we recently worked on 90 Sands, that was the old Watchtower building. We did Bronx Commons. But more importantly, folks, we believe that the depth of our experience in the real estate arena allows us to recognize and solve issues that arise throughout the closing and funding process, so that our developer clients may remain focused on the more important matters to move the development to a successful closing. We're blessed with 5 full-time attorneys. All we do is title. We represent 4 of the major underwriters: Stewart Title, First American, Fidelity, and Old Republic. And folks, it really is an honor. I am a beneficiary of affordable housing, and I certainly believe in the cause that Up for Growth has put forward. So I turn the call back over now to Anjali. Actually, to Caitlin, I'm sorry.
Hi, good morning, and thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Anjali, and the Up for Growth team for hosting today's webinar on fair share laws. My name is Caitlin Harris Walker. I am the Associate Director of Affordable Housing Initiatives at the Mortgage Bankers Association, and we believe and support safe, decent, and affordable housing for all. I'm excited for the opportunity for MBA to sponsor the state series webinars and be a great partner to Up for Growth and the affordable housing industry. Today's webinar has a fantastic lineup of industry experts, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion and thrilled to have the opportunity and platform for the ability to explore the different challenges to affordable housing right now and to seek innovative and successful systematic solutions to our affordable housing crisis. Again, I am excited for the opportunity for the Mortgage Bankers Association to partner with Up for Growth and support and sponsor the state webinar series. And I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Amy Dain.
Hello, everyone. I'm Amy Dain. I'm a public policy researcher. My career has been a tour of Massachusetts-based think tanks, and I've been focusing on zoning policy. Our country has not been producing enough housing. What is causing the underproduction? Well, one of the important drivers is that cities and towns and counties across the country have been using zoning policy and other regulations to prevent needed housing development. So this raises the question for us to address here today is what kind of responsibility should local jurisdictions, local governments have to welcome more housing development and affordable housing. And this isn't a new question. In 1968, before I was born, the US Congress passed the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act describes an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, that government jurisdictions should take meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusivity in regards to race, national origin, disability, and other protected characteristics. Our discussion today will engage this obligation to foster inclusivity that comes with building diverse types of housing, market rate, and restricted affordable housing. Today, we are thinking about fair share broadly, with the aim that the United States will have enough housing for all of our country's people. We'll discuss approaches that different states and counties have taken in figuring out what fair share of housing means and how we might reform laws to make progress to fulfill this goal, this important national value, that all people should have access to housing and opportunities. So now I am going to introduce three of our speakers from across the country. First, Dr. Chris Elmendorf from the University of California, Davis will present, then Kathy Capone-Bennett, the Executive Director of Twin Cities Housing Alliance. And then third will go Eric Schupin, Director of Public Policy at the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, also known as CHAPA, which is based in Massachusetts, where I am. So with that, I will hand it over to Chris to make the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I will try to share my screen. And let us see. Okay, we have do you all see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Great, terrific. Okay, so I'm going to give just a few high-level remarks about the California Fair Share housing system, and then we'll talk more about it in Q&A. In my remarks this morning, I want to first give you some context for where the California system came from, and then talk about some problems with it that may explain why the outcomes have been a little disappointing. So this slide shows California housing prices in relation to housing prices in the rest of the country. And you can see going back to 1940 even, California was a little more expensive than the rest of the nation. And maybe that's not surprising because California has nice weather and people are willing to pay a premium to live there. But something dramatic happened between 1970 and 1980, when California goes from being a little bit more expensive than the rest of the nation to being almost twice as expensive as the rest of the nation. And since 1980, California has persisted in being twice or more than twice as expensive as the rest of the nation when you're just comparing median home values. And in this 1970 to 1980 period, as you might imagine, there was concern about this. There was a sense that something was awry and that California needed to do something differently. And what California came up with, the germ of the idea created in the late 1960s and then finally codified in something approximating its present form in 1980. What California came up with was a system for setting housing targets on a regional level and then allocating those regional targets to cities within each region. So this is sometimes called the RHNA, for Regional Housing Needs Allocation or Regional Housing Needs Assessment Framework. And the process unfolds as follows. First, there's a state agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, that makes a regional needs assessment. That's a quantification of the number of new housing units that region will need over the next 8 years. And then there are regional councils of governments, which you can think of as being like a United Nations for local governments within a metropolitan area. Each local government sends a representative to the Council of Governments, and they hash out a plan to allocate the regional target among cities. Local governments then revise what's called the housing element of their general plan, and through their housing element show or purport to show how they will accommodate their share of regionally needed housing. The State Housing Agency, HCD, then reviews and approves or sends back the housing element. Additionally, housing elements are required to analyze and mitigate or remove non-zoning constraints to the development of housing. So things like excessive impact fees or permitting procedures that are a barrier to development. After a city adopts its housing element, it has 3 years from the deadline for adoption to complete any rezoning that it needs to do to accommodate its share of the regional target. And then finally, the legal status of the housing element as a component of the general plan is at a higher level than local ordinances. You can think of it as kind of being like a constitution for development, and therefore, if there's a conflict between the housing element and a local ordinance, the housing element prevails. Okay, so that's how the system works on paper, but it's long had 3 pretty foundational problems. One is that the definition of regional housing need is grounded in population forecasts, that is household formation forecasts. And a moment's reflection will tell you that if you're in a place that has extremely exclusionary and restrictive land use regulations, you're not going to have much household formation. Indeed, California as a whole is exporting population to states with cheaper housing markets. So a definition of housing need that's based on forecasted population growth kind of assumes away the core of the problem. Second problem is that there's no accounting for the effect of new market rate housing on the availability of more affordable housing elsewhere in the region. So these RHNA targets are set at 4 levels of affordability. There's a lower income, an extremely low income, a middle income, and an above middle income category. But the assumption is that housing that is affordable to people earning, let's say, up to 40% of the median income in a region, that such housing only becomes available when new housing is put on the market and sold or rented at a price those households can afford. And that's just false. As an empirical matter, the way that most people get affordable housing in a functioning housing market is by, or I should say most middle income or lower income people get housing in a functioning housing market is buying used housing, secondhand housing, so to speak, just like used cars. But that effect of new housing on the availability or lack of availability of housing at other segments of the market is not part of the framework. And finally, the state has long, at least tacitly, presumed good faith on the part of local governments. So the legal standard for a valid housing element was very deferential to cities. Similarly, the legal standard for whether local ordinances were consistent with the housing element was very deferential to cities. And there was no reward or penalty for housing outcomes, which led many people, I think fairly, to criticize this framework as kind of a paper exercise rather than a housing production exercise. So with that, my 5 minutes are up, and I'll happily talk more in the Q&A about recent reforms that are at least somewhat improving the framework. And as well, I believe my slides will be posted, and those slides have more information about what's changing now. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And Amy, you had mentioned that I would go third, but I think, Kathy, if you don't mind, I think we had talked about you going third because you're going to share a regional approach, and I'm going to do another statewide approach here in Massachusetts. So hope you don't mind me jumping in. So my name is Eric Shupin, and I'm the Director of Public Policy at Citizens Housing and Planning Association, otherwise known as CHAPA. And I'm going to hopefully be able to share my screen and take over Chris's slides. Do folks see the Up for Growth slide?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for hosting CHAPA. We're a statewide advocacy organization that has provided leadership in housing since 1967 in the Commonwealth. And we believe that everyone should have a safe, healthy, accessible, and affordable home in a community that they choose here in Massachusetts. And we do that largely through advocating for opportunity, which is what I lead as the Director of Public Policy, expanding access to housing and developing the field. In Massachusetts, we're the only statewide group that represents everyone in the housing ecosystem and are more than 1,200 organizational members. We are a trusted convener and consensus builder to a wide range of interests to make sure that our state and local communities enact and invest in smart policies for our people and for affordable housing. And so what I'm going to talk about today is Chapter 40B, a law that, as you'll see, was passed back in 1969, but something that CHAPA played an integral part in getting passed. So our fair share law, colloquially known as 40B, is also known as our affordable housing law, or the comprehensive permit law, or what I really like, the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. It was created back in 1969 to expand the number of communities with homes for low and moderate incomes by reducing barriers to production created by local approval processes, zoning, and other restrictions. In Massachusetts, there's long been a cherished tradition of local independence when it comes to zoning, something we refer to as our doctrine of home rule. That means that every city and town, all 351 making up our wonderful Commonwealth, has nearly complete control over zoning. Of course, we know that zoning sets the rule for what gets built, and in more cases than not, what doesn't get built, who gets to live in a given community, and who does not get to live in that community. To say that this has resulted in a colorful patchwork of zoning outcomes would be putting it politely. This model of hyper-local zoning controls in Massachusetts creates a statewide housing challenge of not enough homes, and certainly not enough affordable homes, that leave too many people, particularly communities of color, without meaningful housing choices. In 1969, 40B passed at a time of unease in Massachusetts between urban and suburban legislators and coalitions. Urban legislators who worked to support 40B along with pro-housing activists like CHAPA denounced suburban legislators who were opposed to accepting affordable housing in their own neighborhoods. Over 50 years later, this conversation continues today. Since its passage, Chapter 40B has become and remains the strongest affordable housing production tool in Massachusetts. The law essentially allows the override of local zoning decisions by a city or town for particular subsidized housing developments if that community does not have its fair share of affordable housing. It allows affordable housing developers, where at least 20 to 25% of those homes are affordable, to apply for all necessary approvals from a municipality in the form of what's called a single comprehensive permit. If the municipality has less than 10% of its year-round housing is subsidized, or has made little progress recently in creating subsidized homes, developers can ask the state to overturn a local denial of a comprehensive permit. To many cities and towns, hitting the 10% affordable housing threshold represents doing their fair share in providing affordable homes. The Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development maintains the official tally of homes that qualify as affordable housing on our subsidized housing inventory. This inventory is based on the total number of year-round homes as determined by the census every 10 years. In that way, these numbers are not fixed, as both the number of affordable homes that count towards the 10%, as well as the total number of homes in a given city or town can change over time. However, in order to count on the subsidized housing inventory, a home must meet certain criteria. The home must be subsidized, have at least 25% of the homes be affordable to those at or below 80% of the AMI, or 20% of homes affordable to those at or below 50%, so getting to a little deeper affordability. The affordability restrictions must run at least 30 years. Development must be subject to a regulatory agreement and monitored, and developments must meet affirmative marketing requirements. Of note, 40B can be used to create both affordable rental and affordable home ownership opportunities. Now, like any other zoning process, the process is very straightforward and not complicated in the least. Okay, perhaps a better way to describe it is that 40B process is at least a little bit more straightforward than the regular zoning process. In just 5 simple steps, you too can get a comprehensive permit. Step 1 is receiving your project eligibility letter under a state or federal housing program, confirming that the project does in fact qualify as a 40B affordable project. Step 2, you apply for your comprehensive permit to the local zoning board of appeals in the given city or town that you're working in. Step 3 is you wait for that local zoning board of appeals to make a decision, and it can do one of 3 things. It can approve the project as submitted, approve the project with conditions or changes, or deny the project altogether. Step 4 is, if applicable, appeal that decision. If the zoning board denies the project or imposes uneconomic conditions, the developer may appeal the decision to the Housing Appeals Committee if the project is in a community with less than 10% of affordable housing. Step 5 is to wait for that decision from the Housing Appeals Committee, which is a state-level entity which can overrule the decision of the local zoning board unless the project presents serious health or safety concerns that can't be mitigated, and that's something that rarely happens. And it's just that simple. You have your comprehensive permit and can build your affordable housing development in the community that otherwise may not have allowed it. Now, while Chapter 40B remains a controversial law in Massachusetts, as it's still seen as an usurpation of local control when it comes to zoning, the results of the policy in creating housing cannot be understated. Since 1969, Chapter 40B has helped provide permits for over 81,000 homes, with over 76,000 homes outside of Boston and other urban areas. From 2010 to 2020, Chapter 40B permitted over 18,000 homes. At CHAPA, we continue to protect and defend against efforts to repeal or change the law. A key to preserving 40B has been demonstrating that the law is flexible through the regulatory process and can change to meet the evolving needs of both states and communities. The law itself, just 3 short sections in our general laws, is surprisingly simple. Each community must do its fair share in providing affordable homes. I think it's because of that simplicity that 40B has been so enduring and effective, because its core value is that simple and effective, that everyone deserves a safe, healthy, and affordable home in a community of their choice. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Kathy, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Hello all, thank you again for having us speak today, and I will attempt to share my slides. Okay, are they showing up?
Yes.
Great. So very quickly, I just wanted to describe what the Twin Cities Housing Alliance is. I'm the new kid on the block. We're the new organization on the block. We just started this March. It's a new nonprofit, and we are an alliance of professionals who have built, preserved, managed, and financed housing communities throughout the Twin Cities for decades. We're uniquely positioned to guide housing policy decisions that will work for our region, and around the focus of creating a more affordable, equitable, environmentally vital, and environmentally sustainable future for the Twin Cities community. And so what do we focus on? What do? We advocate and educate to promote policies that foster healthy housing market, protect and enhance existing housing, and produce more units. So even though this is a new organization, I have been working in the Twin Cities metropolitan region since 1994, prior to the fair share law that I am going to talk about. And just to give you context as to what the area that I am going to cover, the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan statistical area is broader than this 7-county region of which the Metropolitan Council, who's our MPO, is focused on here today. So just so you know that that's the context that I'll be talking about. So the Metropolitan Council, again, they focus on the 7-county, and they're our metropolitan planning organization. For more than 50 years, they've coordinated regional growth and planning and provides essential services. They really regulate 3 systems: transportation, wastewater treatment, and parks and open space. And then to ensure coordinated, orderly, and efficient development in the region, the Metropolitan Council provides technical assistance, policies, and resources around land use planning, redevelopment grants, housing policy plans. And they also are a housing and redevelopment authority for many of the communities within the 7-county region, and they have 7,200 households that within their HRA. So what is this Livable Communities Act, what we would consider our fair share housing effort? It was created in 1995 by the state statute, the state legislature, and you can look that up, State Statute 473. And it really was at a time when the region was looking to support urban sprawl and to also, smart growth, coordinated systems. And so the Metropolitan Council, because their system supports transportation, wastewater, and parks and open space, they wanted to look at a way to really encourage more coordinated development that it would enhance the use of the things that they actually regulate, which is only those three things. And so through this act, it looked to provide incentives for developing communities to include a full range of housing opportunities, to provide incentives to preserve and rehabilitate affordable housing in fully developed areas, and really to incent this more compact and efficient development. So they were designated with funding really to look at ways to fund projects that interrelate affordable housing with employment growth areas, so supporting more affordability around where the jobs are, to intensify that development around their transportation systems, and to really incent and demonstrate ways to create more mixed income and mixed land use types. It was, as many of the other presenters talked about, it was controversial, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my presentation here. So really, this is the carrots rather than the sticks approach. It's a much lighter touch approach than California and Massachusetts. And their specific component around developing affordable housing, they put together the housing needs over a 10-year period, and then they ask communities to accept specific goals. And it's really important to identify the difference between needs and goals in looking at this approach. So the one area that the Metropolitan Council can regulate is that for communities within the 7-county metropolitan region, they are required every 10 years to put together a comprehensive land use plan that identifies, based upon their growth, how they are going to utilize and have a need for the transportation, wastewater, and parks as part of the Metropolitan Land Planning Act. So cities are not required to create enough units to meet their share of the need, but they must plan for the possibilities that these units are guided, they guide sufficient land at higher densities to accommodate that need. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to, that they're required to accept developments in those areas. It just means that they need to guide their land efficiently to be able to allow it. So it's more of a guide than a requirement. And then the Livable Communities program, it is a voluntary program to help communities achieve their fair share of affordable housing goals. And not all the communities have to participate in this Livable Communities program, but if they do, they have the ability to access funding support, and noting that their goal is aspirational, but the goals are not part of the comprehensive plan requirements under this Land Planning Act. And so these are the participating communities within the region, and as you'll see, not all of the communities buy into this, but all of these communities are required to put together a comprehensive plan. So these communities that are not buying into the Livable Communities Act cannot access funding resources to help them achieve those goals. What are some of the program outcomes? Well, the programs focus on several different areas. Affordable housing is one of the key areas that they focus on, but also one of the key parts of the program is to really help fund demonstration projects, things that maybe are a little bit different and difficult to get financed, mixed uses, mixed income, those types of projects. Projects around transit-oriented development, pollution cleanup investigation to support redevelopment, and pre-development and planning money. So some of the outcomes since 1996 to 2018 is they have provided over 1,000 grants with for $401 million. 200 grants were provided to support cities in achieving their fair share of affordable housing. And since 2010, between 2010 and 2016, over 18,000 units have been added utilizing the LCA programs. 45% of those, 8,000, are affordable to households below 60% of the area median income. Now, when you compare that to Boston and California, you know, maybe it might not be as much as we are underperforming for sure, but I did look at some of the data between Minneapolis and St. Paul and the suburban areas, and really this was a program to kind of get the suburban areas to accept their share of housing. And between 2004 and 2010, the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul created about 5,600 units of new affordable housing. In the suburbs, conversely, all the suburban communities did about 2,200. But when I looked at 2020 alone, Minneapolis and St. Paul only created around 600 affordable units, and the suburbs created 1,000. So over time, with the resources that the Metropolitan Council through the Livable Communities Act has been providing, all these technical resources and education and information, I do believe it has been effective in identifying and talking about the importance of providing this full range of housing, not only within Minneapolis and St. Paul, but also within the whole entire region. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and we can go into the conversation.
Yay. Thank you for such wonderful presentations, Kathy, Eric, and Chris. This is great. Are we all spotlighted now for the discussion? Ready to go? I still see the PowerPoint. Okay, here we are, ready to go. So my first question is related to the fact that there's long been a tension in this space between a focus on voluntary planning programs and like local definition of what fair share means, and on the other hand, higher level like mandates and requirements for production or zoning capacity or percentages of affordable housing. And could you speak a bit about that tension between the two types of approaches, what the pros and cons are of the different sides, and where you kind of think your states and counties should be landing on this issue?
Who do you want to start with, Amy?
Oh, anybody? Are you?
Well, I'll jump in since I'm the lightest touch of this voluntary carrots program. And I would say that even in our region, this program, even though it's voluntary, is very controversial in that cities don't really want to be told what to do with their land use. And so it is a step in the right direction. However, there have been a lot of, in the last few years, there have been legislative proposals to have more of a strict mandate around affordable housing. And that continues to be part of the conversation. So I don't know where that will go in this next legislative session. Honestly, this next legislative session in Minnesota, we have a Democratic governor, a House, and a Senate. And if that's something that they would support, it may have a higher probability of potentially passing this year versus other years. And frankly, the housing professionals that I work with feel like the local government should get out of the way of more production and should be more mandated to allow higher density and affordable housing. And in some cases, political leadership, in some cases, this might be cover for them. So that when NIMBYism comes in and opposes these projects, that this could create some cover for them. But we're not quite there yet. So, yeah.
do you know, are they, when discussion comes up about mandates, is it like a general conceptual idea, or is there a more specific discussion there about like what the mandates would be, like production quotas, or like how they would frame it?
The legislative proposals have some specifics around how it would be mandated. I think it would go back to their comprehensive plans, at least in the metropolitan region. I suspect in the greater metropolitan region and the greater rural areas, there would have to be some ways where they would have to come up with measures and support. So there's been some discussion, probably not enough. So that may actually be a good next step, is let's have better conversations about what this means and how you would measure and what it would mean looking at other examples across the country.
Right. Cool. Thank you. Either of you?
I would jump in from Massachusetts' perspective. I mean, and from CHAPA's perspective, it's always a both and approach. Carrots versus sticks. We need all the tools in the toolbox that we can get. And we do work hard at CHAPA, but also in Massachusetts, to support communities in doing the right thing when it comes to affordable housing and allowing more affordable homes. But that's, housing is not a just an individual community by community issue. It's a statewide issue. It's a national issue. In looking back at 40B, there was a quote by the Senate president at the time, back in 1969, that still sticks out with me every time I see it. And the Senate president said, in passing 40B, I've reached the harsh and inescapable conclusion that our local communities left to their own devices cannot and will not undertake constructive action designed to make affordable housing available in sufficient quantities. Now that's a really dramatic quote, I think, because I don't want to think of it as pitting one against the other, state versus local communities. But we all need to be working together towards the shared goal of allowing enough affordable homes. And that's why we need both the incentives and working with communities, but also saying, no, this is a statewide issue, so we're going to take a statewide approach to solving it.
Chris, what's your take?
So the movement in California over the last half dozen years or so has been pretty decisively away from local control. The RHNA framework was supposed to balance state and local interests by having the state set targets, but then cities decide how they were going to meet those targets. And what cities did was that they quite blatantly assigned their targets to sites that they knew couldn't be developed. And cities had better information than the state about which sites were good candidates for development. The state didn't have the staffing to monitor those plans or to do economic feasibility analyses. And so it sort of turned into this cat and mouse game that the cities were winning, and the affordability picture was not getting better. And so the state has both created ever more demanding standards for what counts as a site, as an eligible site onto which a city can assign a share of its portion of regional need, which cities then complain makes life impossible for them because they don't have any qualifying sites or they can't find qualifying sites, and that's a legitimate complaint. And the other thing the state has done is it's just said, this RHNA framework isn't working or isn't working well enough, and so we need to do direct state upzoning. And the one state intervention that has really clearly paid off in California is a mandate that says every homeowner gets to add 2 accessory dwelling units to their property. ADU production has boomed since the state ADU laws were strengthened in 2017. And I think that's kind of an interesting example because it's both a state mandate on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a mandate that also aligns with the economic interest of a lot of homeowners. And so once the ADU model got established, even if there was some kind of resistance to trying it out locally, once it got established, it seems to be self-sustaining.
That's fascinating. A couple of you mentioned assessments and needs and allocation of responsibilities. Like, are you are your areas really like coming up with numbers of like, we need 2 million new homes or 50,000 new homes, and actually allocating so that communities have like a benchmark they're working towards, even if it's not like a production target or, you know, a zoning mandate, but just a sense that our community is responsible for allowing this much housing? Are they doing that? Are they getting that specific?
Can I speak to that? Because
Yeah.
I actually think this is the most stark contrast between the California model and the Massachusetts model. So the Massachusetts model doesn't set overall housing production targets. It sets the percentage of the pie that should be affordable. So you can be an exclusionary suburb in Massachusetts where your pie is way too small. And so long as 10% of your pie, that is 10% of the number of housing units in that exclusionary jurisdiction, are affordable, you've met your target. In fact, it seems to me from the outside that the Massachusetts model may create a perverse incentive for jurisdictions not to permit new market rate housing, because as you permit new market rate housing, by extension, you're raising the amount of affordable housing you need to allow as well, or else you're going to fall short of the 10% benchmark. Whereas in California, there's an overall housing target that's set on a regional level, and then that overall housing target is partitioned into different affordability bands. And as I said in my remarks, I think there's big problems with the sort of accounting system and the failure to account for the indirect effects of new market rate housing on the availability of more housing in other segments of the market. But at least California is not making the mistake of defining targets as a percentage of the pie without regard to the size of the pie.
If you allow me to respond, I'll just say, I mean, in Massachusetts, we don't need perverse incentives to not zone for housing because we're just not going to do it anyway. And I mean, I am saying that too lightly, and I don't mean it that way, but there is that contention there, yes, and we have seen that play out. But again, like I said, many communities will not allow housing for a whole host of reasons, and I'm not sure how high on the list 40B is one of those reasons, but we have recognized that, and we are working towards trying to address those challenges. We have a new law that was passed last year that does set numbers, zoning standards for the amount of homes that a community must allow to be permitted by right for multifamily zoning in Eastern Massachusetts. And so, again, these are recent developments that it's still being implemented today, but saying, okay, in Eastern Massachusetts, if you're served by public transportation, you have to have a certain amount of your housing be allowed by right, multifamily zoning, and it has to be a certain percentage of the overall housing of the community. And so it's not concerned specifically with affordable housing like 40B, but it goes to that question of should we be mandating or talking about our fair share of affordable housing or just housing. It really gets at that. And so we hope that these two tools can work together in saying, yes, we recognize that communities that have historically been exclusionary, you have to do a lot more zoning and allow a lot more housing by right. And we hope that a lot of that is going to be affordable, and 40B is something that can help us get there on that.
Right, this is a major experiment nationwide, like an innovation, a new approach, and it's just now being implemented. So it's sort of a space to watch if you're interested in fair share, which I'm assuming you are because you're here in this event. Kathy, did you have something?
Yeah, just real quick. I don't work for the Metropolitan Council. I never have. I've just worked with them for many years, and they actually do have a fairly robust research and data department that does put together these, projections on employment growth and affordable housing need, and they have gotten a lot better and designate that per community, and they've gotten a lot better in this last 10-year phase of identifying the affordability percentages that communities should meet. So the conflict is there's the need number, and then there's the individual community goals. And those aren't done at the same time. They're not necessarily aligned with each other. And so there's a lot of negotiation back and forth. And if you don't meet any of these goals, there's no like hammer that comes down on you. Basically, you have to put in your comprehensive plan how you will meet that need by designating areas for high density. And in theory, you're supposed to rezone those areas to meet the comprehensive plan, but that doesn't always happen over time. And communities push back in the fact that we don't do development as a city. So how can we make sure that development happens without really saying, well, you really do because you control the land use. So it's just constant tension around this. I feel like through their technical assistance and through some of these grants that we've made strides, but we could be doing better.
Chris, you mentioned about the housing element of the plans could trump the zoning in certain situations. And like, I was wondering if you could say more about who's like adopting those plans, like they're voted on, and how that works for the plan to have more authority than the zoning.
Yeah, so there's two parts to that story. One is just background principles of California general plan law. California is what's known as a strong plan state, meaning that the provisions of the plan are legally enforceable. In other states, many other states, the provisions of the general plan or the comprehensive plan are just advisory. You can't be enforced in court.
And city councils are voting to approve them the way they would a law.
City councils vote to approve, yes, the housing element of the plan. And city councils can amend the housing element of the plan as well. But the housing element is stickier than other parts of the general plan because it has to be approved by the state housing agency, and amendments to the plan have to be submitted to the state housing agency for review and approval as well. And if the plan is disapproved or if it is decertified based on an amendment, then the jurisdiction is subject to a bunch of other sanctions. So that has the effect of making the housing element a more binding, harder to change, at least unilaterally by the city council than other ordinances. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the legislature has passed some very specific laws that say if you're developing an affordable project, which is defined as one which is 20% low income or 100% moderate income with income restricted units, and the project is on a site that is in the jurisdiction's housing element, then if the density of the project is consistent with what the housing element proposes for the site, the local government can't deny the project or render it infeasible with conditions of approval, even if the zoning of the site is inconsistent with the project. And that gets to the problem that Kathy described of a city adopting its comprehensive plan, but then never updating its zoning to match the plan.
So I've read a lot of plans in Massachusetts, and often like they can include very vague language. So like they say that this industrial area should be like looked at for like the possibility of housing. The plans aren't like so specific, and I feel like the more that the plans had the like same weight as zoning, like the more vague the planning laws might get, you're going to be held to it. I
Yes.
feel like they're very careful in writing that so that they won't like be held to account to what's in the plan. And there's just a lot of language about like future investigation and just sort of targeting like topics that could be looked at further. How does that work there? Like, or in
So that is exactly what cities have done traditionally with their housing elements. But the state housing agency isn't letting them do it that way.
Okay.
During the current planning cycle. It says we want to see specific enforceable commitments with deadlines.
So then is it hard to get the affirmative vote once they're written with specifics and when people understand that that has the same thrust as zoning?
Well, it's hard to get the affirmative vote until you start talking about the consequences of not getting the affirmative vote.
Okay.
So one thing that's very interesting in California and occurred in a kind of happenstance fashion, or became a real thing in a kind of happenstance fashion, is that going all the way back to 1990, there's a provision of state law that says if you don't have a compliant housing element, you can't rely on your zoning or general plan to deny or render infeasible an affordable housing project. It's kind of like the New Jersey Mount Laurel Builder's Remedy or the Massachusetts Chapter 40B process, except that there's not a comprehensive permit system. It's just one provision of a state law saying you can't use your zoning in these circumstances. And for 30 years, nobody used that provision of state law. And I can give you some theories as to why nobody used it, but I think it really had to do with the fact that developers were at the mercy of city councils because multifamily housing in particular was discretionary everywhere, even where it was zoned for. Cities had other discretionary review vehicles. And so you couldn't make money as a developer unless you were in the good graces of the city council. And the state legislature has changed a number of laws recently that create ministerial pathways to getting various types of projects approved. And so suddenly there's a new class of developers that are developing business models that are based on knowing their legal rights rather than being in the good graces of the city council. And in Santa Monica, which is a wealthy city in the Los Angeles region, right on the Pacific Ocean with very high housing prices, Santa Monica was out of compliance for a year trying to get its housing element adopted, and it had a 3-2 NIMBY majority on the city council. So there's a lot of resistance to doing any kind of upzoning. And 2 weeks before the city's final deadline for the details don't matter, but final deadline for getting its plan certified, a lawyer submitted proposals for 16 projects totaling 4,500 units that are up to twice as tall as zoning allows, and said, look, can't use your zoning to deny these. And word of that spread like wildfire around the state. It's got tons of media coverage. And all of a sudden, if you go to public hearings in, Atherton or Palo Alto or any other city, wealthy, traditionally exclusionary suburbs, everybody's talking about the builder's remedy and what's going to happen if we don't get our plan certified. And in Santa Monica, despite having this sort of anti-housing majority on the city council, their housing element was unanimously adopted, and adopted as fast as could possibly be following the submission of those 16 projects.
Great insights here. Very helpful. I just wanted to add about 40B as Massachusetts model that while it's been directly responsible for the permitting of over 81,000 homes, it's actually been responsible for the permitting of far more homes. That in my research in a lot of communities, they see that they need to do the rezoning for projects, or it will come back as a 40B and they'll have less leverage over it. So there are plenty of projects that municipalities might have turned down or not rezoned for if it hadn't sort of been hanging over them that can happen. And even in the city I live in Newton, a suburb of Boston, we had a project for 800 units that ended up going to ballot in Newton. And people were debating whether the rezoning should stand to allow the 800 units to go through. And everybody was saying, like, the big thing was, if we don't approve this, it's going to happen anyway as a 40B and with a lot fewer of the public benefits that the city council had negotiated into the project. And so we see this, it's interesting to me because it's a model for the fair share of affordable housing in communities, but it has enabled the permitting of many market rate units and affordable units. It's been a pretty significant tool and spurred communities to proactively plan, I think, in my view of how it's gone. Yeah, Eric, you want to add to that?
I would agree with you on that, that it's even the threat of a 40B is a powerful tool in Massachusetts of, walk lightly and carry a big stick. That's a really big stick that communities often look to, like, wait a second, if we don't do something now, we're beholden to 40B, and then we'll have no control whatsoever. And so, yeah, that's a motivating factor.
Yeah, so we only have a couple of minutes left and just wanted to give you an opportunity if you have any closing thoughts, and in particular, looking forward towards, are there uses of fair share thinking and concepts that you'd like to see implemented in your areas in new ways, or continuing on the paths that you're on?
Well, I think in our market and with the Twin Cities Housing Alliance, I mean, we're just really talking about the importance of a full range of housing along the entire continuum, and to take the barriers away to allow for that development, because we're at a very, big supply shortage in our region, and that's going to impact the economic competitiveness of us as a region and as a state overall. And so we'll continue to support those types of policies, and we will be required to work with the Metropolitan Council and how they, work with communities in developing these policies, and just want to be part of that conversation. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Eric?
I would say, I mean, we're constantly looking at what's next. What else can we be doing? We know that we intentionally created a lot of these segregated communities that we see today here in Massachusetts. And so we need to be just as intentional about undoing those exclusionary practices. 40B is one tool. The multifamily zoning requirement for Eastern Massachusetts that recently passed is another. But we are thinking about, okay, what are those other barriers, like Kathy said? Should we allow accessory dwelling units by right everywhere in Massachusetts? Should we remove parking minimums so that doesn't stand in the way of building housing or affordable housing? So there's so much more that we can be doing, and then also investing in affordable housing. We want to create housing, but we also know we need housing for all income levels. And so we need to make sure that not only are we zoning for, but we're also providing the resources to create the affordable housing to serve our lowest income households.
Right on. And Chris, final words real quick, because we're...
Yeah, I would like to see more attention to prices in the setting of housing targets, and more attention to the metropolitan regions that have managed to grow economically and population-wise while keeping prices low. Those are mostly in the South, and they've mostly grown through sprawl. And even if on the Northeastern California you don't like the sprawl model, I think we have to kind of come face to face with the reality that those are the places that have managed to keep housing affordable while growing economically.
Thanks. Anjali, are you closing us out?
Yes, I am. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today. And what a fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Chris Elmendorf, of course, Eric Shupin, and Kathy Capone-Bennett. And I'd also love to thank our moderator, Amy Dain, who did a tremendous job. If you want to dig more deeply into the presentations from our speakers, we will be following up with all of their presentations for registered attendees. I'd also like to thank once again our sponsors, the American Planning Association, the Mortgage Bankers Association, and the All New York Title Agency. If you're interested in joining Up for Growth or would simply like more information on our pro-housing work, please find us at upforgrowth.org. Our broad range of stakeholders, which includes practitioners, policymakers, and activists, is always growing to include more groups and individuals who believe housing should always be an opportunity and never an obstacle. Finally, if you enjoyed today's webinar, please join us in our final webinar of the series in December, which will focus on closely examining land bank policy. We hope you have a wonderful day and take care.